We're going to start this video on the problems of defining development with a question. How would you define happiness? What does it mean to be happy? And I guess if you reflect on that, you're going to think maybe some things to do with having enough money, having a safe home to live in, having friendships, having a sense of meaning and purpose in your life. But I guess if you were to start to chat to a few other people about how they would define that term, you might begin to get a little bit of difference of views and opinions. People might end up defining happiness slightly differently. And indeed, if you start to take a look at some of the choices they make with their lives, perhaps those choices reveal how they define happiness. Is it defined in terms of the things that they own, or is it defined more in terms of the quality of the friendships and the relationships that they have? Now, that might seem like a strange place to start a video on defining development. So why are we starting here? Well, basically because the question of how we define development is much more like the question of how we define happiness than it is how we define some other things within geography. For example, define corrosion when it comes to rivers, and pretty much every geographer is going to agree with that. They may word it slightly differently, but the meaning is going to be absolutely the same. Development as a definition is not like that at all. It's much more like the definition of the term happiness because it brings us into a sense of values. What do we value in life? What do we think is important? What is worth pursuing? And those values spill over into how we then come up with the definition of the term development. And that's why it can be problematic to define, because different people bring different values, different principles, different ideals to this whole notion of what does it mean to live a developed life on this planet. So we start by saying defining development has proved to be a difficult task, and there's no single definition that fully captures the complexity of the complex of the concept. Over time, different approaches to development have emerged. And as we go through this video, we're going to basically tell a little bit of that story over the last 70 years or so of how these different aspects of development have come to occupy positions of prominence, starting after the Second World War with a focus on economic development, coming up to the turn of the century, human development, and into the 21st century, sustainable development. So let's begin with economic development. And the story here begins after the Second World War, when there was growing emphasis on economic development, particularly in the Global South and LEDCs. Now, at that stage, the approach that we took was known as modernization, and it focused on achieving economic growth as the key to development. This philosophy encouraged countries to adopt a market-oriented economy, to invest in infrastructure and factories and buildings and electricity supplies, and to attract investment to stimulate growth. Now, the term modernization is an interesting one here because it very much implies that the key to developing for the Global South, for the LEDCs, was for them to become more like us. We had clearly found the successful path to development. We were modern, and they were, well, not modern. And you can see, I think, the values coming through here in something like this whole notion that to become developed is to leave behind the ways that you would have done things, to modernize and to follow us. Now, of course, one of the core indicators for economic development that was used at that time was the GNI per capita. It was used to measure progress. It's easy to measure, it's easy to understand, and is used still to this day very extensively. It tells part of the story. It's important. But of course, it didn't capture the full picture of development, leading to criticism that the focus on economic growth was too narrow. But let's consider for a moment the appropriateness of that as a target. Here is the GNI per capita in 2018. This is the global pattern that you've been used to exploring and describing a lot. And if you look at this global pattern, you can definitely see that there is a degree of difference between the MEDCs and the LEDCs. That line perhaps has some kind of meaning still to this day. But whenever you come down into the LEDCs, you can see that there is a big difference between the continents. South America seems to have a higher GNI per capita. Then you would bring Asia. There's a little bit more variety in there. And then down at the bottom of this pile in terms of GNI per capita, is Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. And that is a pattern that we would recognize a lot in a variety of different development maps that we would use today. But let's take a look at the GNI per capita in 1954. Now, the first thing to say is that these values here for GNI per capita have been corrected for inflation, so we are actually comparing like with like. What are the differences you notice here? Well, the first one that strikes me is that the countries as a whole weren't as wealthy in 1954 as they are today. So if you look here at the wealthiest countries of America, Canada, Britain, we're coming in at around about 20 to 50,000 or 10 to 20,000, something in that region there. And yet now these countries are up closer to 50 to 100,000. So there has definitely been an increase in wealth per capita across the world. But it's also interesting then to note the differences within the LEDC world, the differences between the continents of the LEDCs. So would we still put South America as more economically developed? Yes, I think we probably would. But what now is the difference between Africa and Asia? Maybe the same, or you might even begin to argue that because of North Africa and Southern Africa, that Africa is perhaps more economically developed than Asia. So the pattern definitely was different. There was definitely a lower overall income, and there were large areas of the global south, large areas of the LEDCs where the income levels were significantly lower than they were in the global north. I wonder, this cartoon that we'd looked at before, does this cartoon give us, or does it represent this in any way better? I know we criticised it heavily before, but perhaps at that stage you can see that there was a little bit more of a sense post-Second World War of a need for the LEDCs to grow economically. So let's take a look at an example of a couple of LEDCs in the journey that they have been on. We're going to look first of all at the UK as a frame of reference. So how would you describe the trend of that line? Well, if we put a best fit line on, it's rising quite steadily. There are a few peaks and troughs, but they tend to be relatively minor. The general trend is relatively stable and steady as it rises from around about 10,000 per person in 1945 up to around about 37,000 per person. Okay, let's now move on to Tanzania, and we'll have a look to see what the situation is there. How would you describe that line? Well, it's very low and largely unchanging until around about the year 2000, whenever it begins to start to rise slightly, but only slightly. Starting at a level there, well, I don't know, is it even up to $1,000 per person and rising up to maybe $3,000 per person in that time period? The economic development in Tanzania has been negligible, and only really in the last 20 years or so have we begun to see a little bit of a rise. But what about South Korea? Now, South Korea, remember, is part of Asia, so post-Second World War, Asia and Africa were very similar in terms of development. But look at the journey that South Korea has gone on. Initially, like Tanzania, its GNI per capita was very low and was rising very slowly. But then, from starting around about 1970, and especially since 1980, the GNI per capita has been growing rapidly. It's been growing much faster than the GNI per capita in the UK has. And now we've gone from a situation where in 1945, South Korea was as poor as Tanzania was then, to South Korea having the GNI per capita that is equivalent to what we find in the UK. And there is no doubt that that has raised the standard of living for millions of people that live in South Korea and has led to improvement in the quality of life. So it's not to say that money is unimportant. The economic development provides the basis for a lot of the social development that can follow on from it. So maybe that focus was correct and appropriate. But it's only half the story. Many LEDCs needed to borrow money to invest in their manufacturing sector, a sector that had been left underdeveloped by colonialism, because during colonialism we were much more interested in exploiting their natural resources and setting up the infrastructure to export them to our countries rather than developing the LEDCs themselves. So they needed to borrow money to invest. If they were going to modernize, they needed to get money, but they didn't have money, so they needed to borrow it. Oh, it was fine for a while, but then whenever the interest rates suddenly rose in the 1970s, this resulted in countries spiraling into debt. And the new borrowing that they had to take in the 70s and 80s came with new conditions called structural adjustment programs. These required indebted countries to spend less on health and education, leading to a terrible decline in social development. This graphic outlines the timeline for this. You borrow to invest, then the interest rates rose, and that led to new borrowing with conditions. They earn more through your cash crops and spend less, particularly on health and education, and the inevitable outworkings of that were the dreadful impact on social development. If a country doesn't invest in health, if it doesn't invest in education, it compromises its ability to make the most of one of its most incredible assets, which is its human population. Never mind the ethical challenges of actually taking some of the poorest, most vulnerable people in the world and taking the very things that they need to survive away from them. There's not a bit of wonder that we really reflected on that moving into the new millennium and brought in a program of debt relief for a lot of these most indebted countries. But this paper from Oxfam from 1998 talks a little bit about the challenges that exist at the time. It said here that Tanzania had been drawing up plans aimed at achieving progress, but encouraging such moves are unlikely to succeed unless the creditors, the people lending to Tanzania, act swiftly to reduce the country's massive debt burden. So Tanzania in 1996 was spending 9 times as much on debt servicing as in basic health, 4 times as much on debt as in primary education. It's not a bit of wonder that the social development was suffering. The turn of phrase here is powerful, I think. Translated into human terms, excessive debt repayments mean schools without desks, pencils and books, and, in many cases, roofs. It means health centres without essential drugs, and it means women having to walk over 3 hours to collect water. It is unacceptable for debt payment to absorb resources to the detriment of social investments needed to enhance human welfare, to sustain growth, and equally important, to convert growth into poverty reduction. And emerging from the limitations of economic development and the value that it placed on the economy into 1990, then is no surprise that a new focus came, a new set of values to influence how people were seeing and framing development. In the 1990s, following the impact of the structural adjustment programs on social development, there was a shift towards a more holistic approach to development with a focus on human development. The United Nations released a definition of development at that stage that said it was a process that creates an environment in which people can enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. So this approach recognized that development was not just about economic growth, but also about improving quality of life. And of course, this is where we had the emergence of the Human Development Index. That composite measure that we're now all so familiar with was introduced by the United Nations as a composite indicator in 1990, incorporating measures of health, education and income. And this intentional wider focus captured a broader range of the progress countries were making towards development. Yes, the economic aspects were still included in there, but also woven in were the social developments. Amartya Sen, who came up with the concept of the HDI, said this: human development is about having the freedoms to lead the kinds of lives we have reason to value. And you can hear again that value statement, can't you? Defining development is all about what we value. However, HDI was also criticised for being too narrow, as there were no aspects of the environment contained within it. In fact, the first Human Development Report of 1990 said this: it is people, not trees, whose future choices have to be protected. Now, I was studying geography at university in 1990, and I remember when we were doing development geography, it really captured me at the time. I thought it was an important and powerful subject to look at. We'd just been looking at these impacts of the structural adjustment programs, and it just felt like there was so much injustice wrapped up in that for me. But I remember us looking specifically at this at the time and thinking, where is the environment? This is setting up a false dichotomy. It's not people or trees. Surely the environment in which we live is a key element to the development that we're going to enjoy. And yet at that stage, the Human Development Index, perhaps reacting against the focus on economics from before and not on humans, is actually making this choose between people and trees. This placed people, not the accumulation of material or natural resources, at the heart of development. There's a valuing there of people, which is right, but there's a devaluing there of the environment. And as we'll see in the Human Development Report of 2020, this false dichotomy has been very much redressed. So it didn't really deal with the environment. The second element that was left out was human rights. Human rights issues were not included. So this means that countries like Qatar can have an HDI right up at the top there of 0.855 in 2023. But serious questions have been asked about the rights of immigrant workers there, especially around building for the 2022 World Cup. So these are some infographics put together by Amnesty International that criticises the immigrant system and the way in which it is operated, the kafala system that arguably exploits these immigrants that are moving, and these people that are already desperately poor, moving from some of the poorest countries in South Asia to try and get some work to send money back to the families at home. And they're not being treated well and properly, arguably. And these infographics tell something more of that story. The HDI does not reflect that. Qatar is a very high HDI value, but there are issues to be asked about its human rights. So, post-Second World War, the emphasis on economic development, which we absolutely needed. There was extreme poverty in many countries in the global south, the LEDCs, and it needed to be addressed. And indeed, there were some countries like South Korea that definitely made tremendous progress. But the emphasis then on the emphasis then on the structural adjustment programs following the debt meant that there were dreadful impacts on social development, as they had to spend less in healthcare and in education. And so we had to focus on human development, putting people at the centre of development, absolutely valuing the improvement in the quality of life for people as the goal of development, and rightly so. However, the criticisms there can be those that are levelled at the fact that environment wasn't included when it should have been, and aspects of human rights and broader aspects of development and social development were not included. So that brings us then to the 21st century and into a concept that we might call sustainable development. In recent years, there's been a growing recognition of the need for sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, were introduced in 2015 as a universal call to end poverty, to protect the planet, there's the environment in there, and to ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. The 17 goals are broad in their scope. Yes, they do include economics in there, and they include social aspects of the development process, and they include aspects of the environment. This is a broad, holistic approach to development that values this whole interconnectedness of the sustainable development approach. In addition, the Human Development Report from 2020 radically reframed the approach to development to reflect the fact that we're now in what's known as the Anthropocene. This is the geological age where we are affecting and influencing the planet. It critiqued the 1990 Human Development Report, which of course, remember, had a focus on people, not trees, stating that it was wrong to see the people and environment as two opposed issues. Instead, it stated that leaving nature in the background, or worse, presenting choices as if they were between people and planet, will limit human flourishing for everyone. The values here are saying this: we need to protect the environment in which we live, because we live in the environment in which we live, and it is going to affect us. If the environment presents challenges to us, it will affect us. We are inextricably linked and bonded together. As the 1994 Human Development Report stated, the strongest argument for protecting the environment, at that stage, this is 1994, is the ethical need to guarantee to future generations opportunities similar to the ones previous generations have enjoyed. This guarantee is the foundation of sustainable development. And that's actually very much the values that we were talking about when I was in university in the early 1990s. Sustainable development was all about the future. It was all about the legacy that we pass on, the heritage that we give to the generations that come behind us. It was asking us to make some sacrifices now, even though we weren't facing the consequences, in order to protect our children and our children's children. It was very noble, it was very ethical, and it was very future orientated. But the 2020 Human Development Report is saying that these impacts are no longer solely for future generations. Planetary imbalances are already hurting people. The reality of climate change is not any longer something that is far off in the future that will only affect our children and our children's children. They're here now. They're affecting us already. And they're particularly compromising the ability of many of the poorest people in the world, who are already most vulnerable, to achieve that progress in development. And the approach now from the Human Development Index is really to question whether that fundamental difference between people and trees was the appropriate approach. Amartya Sen, remember, he came up with the HDI in 1990. He says this now: it's not so much that humanity is trying to sustain the natural world, but rather that humanity is trying to sustain itself. It is us that will have to go, unless we can put the world around us in reasonable order. The precariousness of nature is our peril, our fragility. It's no longer people or trees. We live in the environment, and we're dependent upon it. So the 2020 Human Development Report recognised that much of the progress that the MEDCs made. Why are we so developed? Well, it was fuelled by using the resources that generated today's ecological crisis. Why is the reality of climate change and resource overuse hitting us now? Because that modernisation approach that we followed actually led to this. So back in the 1950s, when we thought we were all that, oh, you LEDCs, you should copy us. We are the modernised countries. You need to do what we have done. Arguably, that very road that we have followed has led to the global crisis of the environment that we're facing today. The 2020 Human Development Report also called for a reimagining, a revaluing, there's the values coming in again, of the approach to development that calls on all countries to improve well-being equitably. That's the focus on people, while easing pressures on the planet. So you have interesting data being generated by the United Nations Development Report in 2020. Down the bottom here, we've got the Human Development Index. And up the side here, we've got the material footprint per capita. This is the amount of resources countries use per person. And what we need to do here is to see if we can get a way of moving the countries down at the bottom left. These are countries that are have got a lower human development index, where the livelihoods and the life chances of people are not as good and are compromised. We need to move them up towards this end of the HDI, but not up into this place where the MEDCs are. We need to find alternative routes, which is to move them up the Human Development Index whilst keeping the material footprint low. They need not to follow us in the route to modernisation, you might argue. They need to find a new route. Well, what about us? Well, yes, and we need to work together to find a route to get to maintain the high level of Human Development Index, but to reduce our impacts on the environment. We need to be working together globally to find ways of improving the quality of life for people that manages to have as small a footprint as possible in terms of impact on the environment. And to help with that focus, the United Nations Development Programme introduced or produced a new adjusted HDI in the 2020 report called the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI. Now, you're used to adjusted figures. You know, the GNI per capita can be adjusted to produce the PPP, Purchasing Power Parity, to make it easier to compare what you can actually buy with the same amount of money in different countries. So this is another approach similar to that. It is adjusting the HDI, and it's adjusted to reflect the CO2 emissions and the material footprint. So there's the CO2 emissions per person and the material or resources footprint per person. Those are put together to produce an adjustment factor which is combined with HDI, and then you end up with the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI. And the focus then that we need to be doing as we're moving forward is really to try and find ways of living sustainably, to generate the resources and the growth that we need, but to do so in a sustainable manner that protects the environment in which we live. So if you take this data set and look here at the HDI rank of the countries across the world and the PHDI rank, there's a very interesting trend here. As HDI rank increases, the higher values are here. So I suppose I should frame this as the rank decreases as you get closer to the top. You drop down in terms of the rank of the PHDI. So we've got countries down here which have a high PHDI rank. They're having minimum impact on the environment, but a low HDI rank, the human development aspects are lower. Then we've got countries up here which are higher on the HDI rank, but they're much, much lower on the PHDI rank because of the pollution and the material uses that we have. The ideal place for us to be, of course, is here. There are currently no countries here that are high on the HD rank and high on the PhD rank. These are countries that have high quality of life for people and are not making as much of an environmental impact. But that's the secret. That's where we need to be getting to. And if we map these out, we see an interesting pattern across the world. This is the difference between the rank of HDI and PHDI. The green colours are their PHDI rank is higher than their HDI. And the orange and reds are their HDI rank are higher than their PHDI rank. So this is an interesting global pattern. Whenever we started with this map and we had a look at this is the GNI per capita, and we definitely saw, yes, North America and Europe are more economically developed than the LEDCs. You've got South America first, then Asia, and then Africa, especially Sub-Saharan Africa. It's that classic pattern. But we bring this in and it's almost like we've reversed it. What we're seeing here is that the countries that are having the least environmental impact are these countries that are lowest down here in the GNI per capita. Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, and the countries with the highest GNI per capita are having the highest environmental impact. So this diagram that we've been using to frame our discussions, to what extent does this represent the global pattern of development? I mean, we critiqued it heavily when we first saw it, far too simplistic. It's just the extremes. What about the variety in between? But arguably now, when you look at something like this, you reframe all of that smoking and the squeezing of the globe very, very differently. Nobody comes out of this particularly well, do they? We need to improve the quality of life of the poorest people who are struggling because of just the fate of where they were born in life. But we also need to tackle the way in which we are generating the very growth that we have become so dependent on. Can we continue to sustain exploiting the planet and the resources in the way in which we have been? Absolutely not. The environment in which we live is the environment in which we live. And if we don't look after the environment, we look after the very habitat that we are so dependent upon. So our journey has been a journey of values, a journey of evolving ideals, starting with the focus in economic development, arguably a necessary focus. Money is important in order for us to be able to invest in improving the quality of life for people. The issues there, of course, were that particularly because of the debt crisis, the focus on the economy at the expense of the people, especially healthcare and education, was wrong. And so we move into human development to try to redress that imbalance, to bring back the values towards what should be at the centre of development, and that is the people. And the HDI as a measure was looking at this composite measure which included economic and social indicators. But it was criticised, the human rights issues that were not addressed in it, and its ignoring of the environmental aspects. In fact, the very first Human Development Report saying it's people, not trees, which brings us then into the more recent approach with the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2020 Human Development Report, saying that we need to protect the environment in which we live because it's the environment in which we live. And introducing the PHDI, that measure alone won't change anything, but at least the focus on it, at least now that we're talking about it, at least now that we've got graphs and maps that can tell a story that challenge the values, it maybe allows us to reevaluate and to come up to a new position and a new understanding of what it means to be developed. Does it mean to be happy? Oh, that's not an easy question to answer. What does it mean to be developed? That's not an easy question either. It's full of values. It's full of what we think is important in life. And this little video has just reminded us of the journey and the evolution of those values over the last 70 years.